Do roll call?
All's done?
Okay. A review of the minutes. We have a motion to approve the minutes.
I recommend the minutes be approved as written.
Mr. Mesner, do we have any correspondence?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Correspondence for this evening, none other than that related to items on the agenda. I would like to ask the Chair and Commissioners to consider moving the Croatian Way seawall projects at the front of your agenda so that the consultant can make a ferry this evening.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Thank you.
Why don't we start with the consultant then?
So we can go ahead and start with Ms. Tess Cooper. She'll be giving you some presentations on the 3 seawall projects that require a shorelines development permit. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Meismer. Thank you, Madam Chair. So tonight we do have 3 separate projects, 3 separate permits. They are all neighboring properties in the same construction proposal, so we're going to lump them together and just see one presentation. But if you have questions on the separateness of them, just please let us know. So Shoreline Substantial Development Permits 2021 0002, 0003, and 0004 for the Croatian seawall repair. The applicant is Marine Surveys and Assessment on behalf of the landowners Barton Waring, John and Colleen McIntyre, and Alan Horesh. The proposed use is single-family residence and normal appurtenance thereto. The zone for these properties is residential low density. The location is 5005, 5003, and 4909 Croatian Way, with associated parcel numbers listed. Prior meetings for these projects included development review group pre-application conferences and neighborhood meetings. The next required meeting is tonight, July 28th, Planning Commission open record decision hearing. The proposal is to reinforce and repair the existing rock seawall with a light reinforced concrete face butted right up against it as closely as the contractor is able and buried deeper to make further undercutting extremely unlikely. The concrete toe of the existing wall will be removed and the new facing will go in its place, so there will be no new footprint on the beach. Bird's eye view of the project site. You can see all 3 houses marked by red arrows. The project history for this, again, mandatory pre-application was held on July 28th, 2020 and March 23rd, 2021. Neighborhood meetings. The formal application was submitted on May 5th and May 6th of this year and determined complete on May 14th. Noticing for application went out May 26th and noticing for this hearing went out on June 30th. SEPA determination was released on July 28th. There was no public comments received during the 30-day public comment period. Critical areas on the site include Fish and Wildlife Habitat Conservation Area, Marine Surveys and Assessments did a habitat survey and a biological evaluation report, both in June of 2020. They identified no significant adverse effects to the population of listed species, and determinations of not likely to or no effect. A quick map of the survey transects that they did in their habitat survey. The zoning designation is residential low density. The proposed use is single-family residence and necessary appurtenances, which are permitted in the R2 zone. The Shoreline Management Act says the proposed development, since the proposed development lies within 200 feet of the shoreline of statewide significance, then the project must conform with the City of Anacortes' Shoreline Master Program. The subject proposal is located entirely in the Aquatic Shoreline Environmental Designation. And according to Table 5.1 in the SMP, shoreline stabilization hard armoring structures are permitted in the Aquatic Shoreline Environmental Designation. Here's a vicinity map for your idea of the project, just adjacent to Skyline Marina. And the 3 parcels are identified in red for you. Site plans give you an idea of where the existing and proposed bulkheads are in accordance with the high tide line and the ordinary high water mark. This is the drawing representation of what is going to occur with the existing rock wall that is going to be fronted with a new concrete facing and a new footing that is going to go much deeper than the existing. And for those of you unable to attend the site visit today to look at the project, these are some pictures to give you an idea. You can see the 3 seawalls that will be replaced. This is Mr. Waring's property in this seawall stretch. This is McIntyre property and this stretch of seawall. And then a previously permitted project is in the middle there. And then Mr. Horash's property and seawall that needs repaired is located here. Again, this section has been repaired through previous permits, so you can get an idea of what it'll look like. You can see the severe undercutting. There is no footing, concrete footing below the beach grade, which is standard. So with shoreline erosion and storm events, the beach material is being eroded and from in front of and below and jeopardizing the actual footings and foundations of the homes. The placement of the cement facing will be located at or rearwards, landwards of the existing footprint. So there's no more expansion. The footprint will be the same or less than the existing. For an idea, this will be what the construction looks like, and this is what the reinforced wall will look like. It will continue on from here in front of Mr. Horish's and all the way down in front of all 6 of the homes. In the staff report, staff identifies recommendations and conditions of approval. We can go over those really quick for your reference. Based on the findings of facts and conclusions in the staff report, staff recommends the Planning Commission conditionally approve the shoreline substantial development permits for all 3 projects with the following conditions of approval. The scope of the project shall not exceed that set out in the shoreline permit application in accordance with the determinations made and conditions imposed. Exhibit 4 of your packet shows the approved site plan. Steve Lang of Public Works notes a municipal stormwater outfall in the vicinity of the project and requires the location of which to be shown on the plans at the building permit submittal stage. Even though a biological evaluation was submitted, it did not address FEMA floodplain habitat assessment needs. And at the time of the building permit stage, just a small addendum addressing FEMA floodplain needs to be submitted. And again, building permits must be submitted to approve the work as well. All applicable permits, local, state, and federal, shall be secured before construction activities commence. Development shall comply with mitigation measures as listed in the SEPA mitigated determination of significance. Hours of construction work are limited to 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. 7 days a week unless a noise variance is obtained. Noise levels should not exceed those standards established in Washington Code, Revised Code of Washington, and WAC 17360. And again, the applicant's landowner shall comply with all federal statutes, including but not limited to Endangered Species Act, Clearwater Act, Marine Mammal Protection Act, and other federal statutes. The project shall comply with applicable shoreline master program regulations, including but not limited to Section 5.6, the aquatic environment, Chapter 5, shoreline environments and associated policies and regulations, Chapter 6, environmental protections, general regulations, and Chapter 8, specific use policies and development regulations, Chapter 9, specific shoreline modification policies. Development shall comply with the following shoreline permits as followed. Permit conditions, sorry. So construction or substantial progress toward completion must begin within 2 years, and 5-year permit authorization if construction has not been completed within 5 years of approval by the City of Anacortes. The city will review the permit with prior notice to parties of record and either extend the permit for 1 additional year or terminate the permit. Staff reserves the right to supplement the record of case to respond to matters and information raised subsequent to the writing of this report. Again, overall, staff recommends the conditional approval with the conditions as listed in the staff report. If there are any members of the public that want to testify or commission has any questions, we can do that.
There are no online attendees.
There are no attendees in the room.
have any public comment? If we don't have public comment, we will close the hearing, we will open it up to commissioner questions.
Madam Chair, if we could turn the microphone on,
sorry.
that'd be great. Thank you.
There's no public comment? I'll open up the public comment. And there's no public comment online or in person. And we'll proceed to commissioner deliberation and questions.
I have no questions.
No questions? Frank?
I've got a few questions. How many of the homes out there have had this improvement or adding these three in there? Or more importantly, how many are not going, when this is done, how many will not have a new seawall?
Along this stretch, there are 3 that have already done this improvement, 3 within the stretch that is seeing erosion that are seeking the approval today. And those 6 are the only ones that are seeing erosion and potential damage to warrant the need of this. There are 2 homes, 1 on each end, that have existing rock seawalls that are not experiencing the same erosion and damage, and therefore don't meet the requirements for upgrading or reinforcing them at this time.
By changing the configuration, does that change the dynamics of water getting behind the people don't have a wall? Is any chance of water getting behind all these new improvements, though, and causing any problems with pressure on the back of the wall or anything?
Along this stretch, right now, having the difference in seawalls is kind of what creates more backwash, and having all walls along the same face will limit and reduce the amount of impact to the surrounding homes that don't have the same wall or don't have walls at all. The dynamics of the shoreline is different in front of each house. In the areas that don't now are seeing actual deposition of materials instead of erosion.
Okay. And one last question. We have the local approval, state and federal. Is this the first step in that process, and how long does it take typically to do the other 2?
That's a good question. Yes, city is first. We have to do the SEPA determination before they can move on. They need our determination to move on to state level with Fish and Wildlife and the habitat, the HPA permit. They've already initiated the federal process, which takes a lot longer. Meg, do you have more, if you want to come and speak? Meg, this is the applicant's agent who's doing the process, and she can give you a better timeline of the federal permitting.
And I lied. I do have one more question after this one, but anyway.
Hi, I'm Meg Amos with Marine Surveys and Assessments. Yes, we have submitted to the Army Corps of Engineers, and it is a great unknown right now for the length of time it will take to turn a permit around, because they're dealing with consultation with National Marine Fisheries Service, who's been undertaking a revamping of the endangered species programmatic. So there are many, many projects held up there right now, trying to figure out how to deal with mitigation. These 3 projects are actually in consultation with the services, but they're actually batching projects for review because they've got such a backlog of projects, and these 3 projects are not in the current batch. So very likely won't have permits from the Corps until next year's work window.
And then my last question is, does this work all have to be done at low tide, or, I mean, it's very limited when they can do this work on the beach?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand that.
Is the actual construction have to be done during low tides?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's definitely a stipulation. No water on the beach at all, and they're doing the building in 40-foot wall sections so that they can actually, tear down the toe and then rebuild a 40-foot section before the water comes back in.
Okay. Thank you.
Go ahead.
I just have a curiosity question. It says tribes will be notified through the permit review process with the city and Corps of Engineers. Have they been notified?
Yes, they have, and we actually have gotten comments from the tribe. They request to actually be on site or, be invited to be on site during the construction. So the first three, actually there's a third of the 3 walls being built right now that were permitted last year or 2 years ago. Tribes were notified at the beginning of that process for each wall and invited out, and I don't believe anyone ever showed up. But yeah, the Corps of Engineers definitely put out a notice with the tribes and had conversation with them.
Thank you.
Commissioners, any other questions? Do I have a motion to approve by anyone?
Madam Chair, I recommend that we conditionally approve the shoreline substantial development permit as presented, and including the 10 conditions of approval that were listed.
Okay.
And I'll second the motion with conditions is your motion, right?
Pardon me?
The recommendation is with conditions.
With the 10 listed, yes.
Yeah, with conditions. That's part of the permit.
Seconded.
All in favor? Aye.
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 Madam Chair, thank you. Members of the
I guess,
commission.
is that, do we have anything to close, or is that the,
So we have our floodplain management.
oh, floodplain management code
Code.
chapter, okay.
So we
Mr.
can go through that.
Okay.
A couple of things on that. First, I'd like to just
Sorry.
check with our secretary. Let me look here. Dave, can you tell me if Rob is on there? So I think probably the first item for us this evening is Floodplain Management 101. Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, FIRM, flood insurance rate maps. And what does all this mean? Who looks at it? Who determines, the various flood control appurtenances that are necessary for anything that's within the flood zone? And then I can go through some of the changes that are recommended in our floodplain management code. So with that, I'd like to introduce Rob Freisinger. He's our Deputy Building Official and Plans Examiner. And Rob does all the reviews for floodplain management permits. So he should be on the Zoom call. Rob, if you want to come on.
Ready? Can you hear me there?
We can hear you, Rob, but we can't see you.
Okay. Let's see.
There you are.
There we are. Righty. So, yes, I'm Rob Freisinger, the Deputy Building Official, and I review in essence, the flood-related permits. So I basically mocked up a little presentation for you. Flood Management 101. So I'm going to share my screen. This, of course, is the first time I've ever shared my screen on one of these. So, right, so do you have my screen that says floodplain management on that?
Yeah.
Okay. Righty. Anyways, I grew up in a small town with a river at its heart, and it flooded a little bit every year. Salmon in the streets was a regular caption in the local paper's news section. When I was in high school, I got involved in volunteering for emergency sandbagging during floods because, quite frankly, following the cries of a distraught homeowner who's standing on their kitchen table yelling about salmon in their living room is way more entertaining than doing geometry class. And And those sodden days sandbagging sparked my interest in how we interact with our shorelines. Floods are the largest natural source of disaster loss in the United States of America. Even in hurricanes, it's the resultant flooding rather than the winds that cause the most damage. All cities and counties are required to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. The program is designed to limit financial and human losses in flood events. The Federal Emergency Management Agency sets the guidelines and local jurisdictions administer them. The main point of the program is to simply limit building in areas prone to flood risk. Only 2% of flood insurance claims are for buildings constructed after the program was implemented. So the rules seem to be working. Now, we all know we live on an island, surrounded by tidal water. And as such, there are places you could build a building at low tide, but it would be a poor choice within a few hours. There are places you could build a building at high tide, but it could prove to end badly during a storm event. And then there are the places you could build that would withstand a king tide and a storm surge combined with wind-driven waves. We also have some lakes with a flood zone around the edge due to extreme rainfall events, as well as creeks that could potentially be a flood hazard, although we don't have any river flood hazard areas designated, to the best of my knowledge. The National Flood Insurance Program and flood development permits are designed to make sure that folks build in safe places. We use flood development permits as our tool to track and monitor projects in the flood zone. Our flood development permit is a permit that accompanies all building projects that occur in the flood zone. Now, there are some fine points to that all. For instance, floating docks and gangways are not required to have a flood development permit, unless the upland portion of the gangway has something built on it, like a gazebo, and it falls within the flood zone. Projects in overwater buildings, such as on piers, are also not required to have a flood development permit by the state, but they are required to have a current survey showing that they are above the base flood elevation. And we have to check almost all the same information when we have a something that happens on a pier. We used to maintain this information and do this review as part of our building permit, but that made tracking the projects much more difficult, and the state strongly prefers that we have a separate permit type. The state pretty much said, yeah, you don't have to, but you have to. Was their description of their preference. So what is a flood zone? The flood zone is the area between the low water mark and the location with a 1% chance per year water level, like what you would have with an extreme high tide event and a storm surge combined. In a river or lake, it's simply the place between where the normal water level is and the location where there's a 1% chance per year of a high water level. And they pick that 1% chance per year because really what it means is that over the course of a typical 30-year mortgage, there's a 26% chance that the building will be wiped out. And they've set that as their threshold. They basically said if we're going to lose it in the course of a standard mortgage, we don't want to have somebody building there. Now, a flood development permit verifies two important items. The first and pretty basic one is that it assures that a project is relatively safe from water intrusion. We use elevation certificates to assure that the finished project is above the base flood elevation or top of the flood zone. An elevation certificate is a special form for a surveyor to fill out, attesting to the elevation of the structure or project. The other thing that it does, or that we use, is a biological site assessment or habitat assessment. And FEMA got tagged in a lawsuit, in essence, where somebody said, look, you need to keep track of habitat as well as just where the buildings are going. In essence, the critters make sense to keep track of as well. And so even though as part of our shoreline projects, we're going to require a habitat assessment, we also have to review it as part of the flood permit. That's part of a legal opinion. That's the official name is the Biological Opinion for Puget Sound for Protecting Sensitive Habitat and Wildlife. Nickname's BIOP. But anyway, so we'll look at that habitat assessment and verify that any endangered or listed species that may be present will not be harmed. And the first time somebody mentioned in a habitat assessment that the leatherback sea turtle may be present but would not likely be harmed, I figured they were just pulling my leg. So I looked up the range and known travels of the leatherback sea turtle because I figure those are a warm climate critter. It turns out they've been found as far north as the southern waters of Alaska. So they weren't really pulling my leg. They were just being very thorough. And as I mentioned earlier, our shoreline permits overlap in this area. But because we're already gathering that information for the shoreline permit, we don't require anything extra from that aspect for reviewing the flood development permit. We just look at the same stuff twice, or different people in the building look at the same information. So that way there's no additional red tape for your average person submitting something. Now, how do you know where the flood zones are? The answer to that is flood insurance rate maps. I personally use the digital ones for reviews that I do for the city. It makes it easy because you can type in a specific address on a website that the Federal Emergency Management Agency has set up, and it will pull up the flood insurance rate map for a given area. And in this slide we have here, I picked it because it's my view from my office in City Hall, looking out towards the shipyards there. And it shows, in essence, I'm gonna say, I'm squinting because I'm not wearing my glasses. But anyways, I'm gonna say it looks like that's an AE9, which is what they're describing as the high water level for the 1% chance per year. And some of those places have since been filled or are underneath piers. So the actual elevation of the buildings doesn't necessarily jive with where the lines are. We also have paper copies in City Hall, but quite frankly, the digital ones are infinitely easier to use than the paper copies. Now, what are the different flood zones around the city? Because quite frankly, it's not one water level all the way around. That's something to keep in mind. And most of the marine shoreline is AE7, some is AE9, and some is VE9. I'll get into what that means in just a minute. The VE9 is kind of up around Washington Park. The AE7 is sort of more off on the side towards the refinery. Let's see here. The difference between AE and VE, A just means it's a water level. The E stands for elevation. V indicates that there's wind-driven waves. And so AE zones are where you have the water rise, just sort of it rises sort of all at once. And so it's the rising water is the issue that you're dealing with in the AE zone. The VE zone adds wind-driven waves into the mix. So it's not just the elevated water level from your tidal action or your storm surge. It's the wind hammering those waves into buildings and into seawalls in front of buildings. And I'm going to pop back one slide here. On for instance, AE7. 7 is just the elevation of what they expect it to be above the average sea level. And the average sea level, there's actually two different common ones. And let's see. I'm gonna see if I can pull that up real quick. There's like NAVD and like 29 and NGVD 88 or something like that. I lose track of exactly which one is which, but they're basically different standards for what sea level is, and the numbers differ by I think 3.4 feet. So you have to keep track when a surveyor is telling you what the elevation is, which standard you're using to make sure that you're comparing it to the correct level there, because you don't want to say, yeah, build it a foot higher than the storm surge is going to be, and then discover that it ends up being 2.5 feet too low. And then how are the zones determined? They do scientific studies and surveys periodically to review and update the overall maps. Now this happens by periodically, that's like every 20 years or something, they get around to your neighborhood to tune it up. Individual property owners can have individual portions of the maps revised. And there's a couple of different processes for that. It's a letter of map amendment or a letter of map revision, where you formally have a surveyor come in and say, look, this is what we're finding in the site, and this is the actual elevation of the ground. Typically, it's determining the actual elevation of the ground in relation to where the map is. The lower portions of Puget Sound were revised several years ago, and our area is in the works for a revision, but the timeline's not real clear when that's actually going to happen. It's sort of more the level of professionals gossip, or, well, we've heard it's happening, we just don't know when. And sometimes there are map inaccuracies. For instance, you may have, in essence, on the big line they draw may not encompass the very smallest features of the shoreline. So you may have a spit of land that's marked as water or an inlet that's considered land. Typically, these inaccuracies are remedied by the applicant through the map revision process, although the director of the department or their agents are permitted to make a judgment call as to where the flood zone is. Now, I used to work in Island County, and there were places where there's like 200-foot high bluffs, and at times there'd be a blip in the line, and they would show the top of the bluff as being in the flood zone. That's the kind of situation where a director or the director's agent may say, look, this building is on the top of a 200-foot bluff. We're more concerned about erosion with the building dropping from that height than we are about floods. So we're going to say, look, it doesn't need a flood development permit, even though the shaded portion of the map may show it in the flood zone. If it's anything near the water, whether it's 2 feet or 10 feet that they're trying to decide, we use surveys and studies and the map amendment process to take that into account. And let's see, just for the record, on our AE zone versus VE zone slide here, the VE zone is out by Skyline. Actually, the VE zone technically starts behind where this picture is taken, further up the coast, but those sure look like wind-driven waves to me. And the water in the room picture on the left is actually up near Bellingham. It was a restaurant a couple of years ago. They had a storm surge that swamped the place. Now, ultimately, what it gets down to is that the Federal Emergency Management Agency helps protect us from disasters, using the ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure concept. They focused on mitigation strategies. Flood development permits and requiring that new construction takes place either outside of the flood zone or elevated above it is a cornerstone of that. And city planning, community, and economic development departments are the boots on the ground, assuring that disasters don't have the opportunity to occur. And that's all I got for you, folks.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Frischinger. Do any commissioners
Welcome.
have any questions?
Just to share with you guys, since I've been involved in real estate finance for 42 years in federally insured banks, which basically is every bank in the state of Washington, for example, anytime you get a home loan, you may not be aware of it, but the appraiser and the lender are determining what flood zone you're in. And in Anacortes, it's a non-event. But if you're in Burlington, Mount Vernon, it definitely is a factor, because if you're in a 100-year flood zone, we are required to make the customer pay for flood insurance. And it can be very subtle. You drive up College Way, cross the railroad tracks, you're in a flood zone. You go 2 blocks and the road is elevated enough that you're no longer in a flood zone. That's how sensitive that determination can be, just a matter of a little bit up a road. Again, it's expensive. I would say for the average homeowner, it would cost $1,500 a year in addition to their fire and hazard insurance. So a lot of people will shop for homes depending on what the flood zone is. And again, if in Anacortes, you wouldn't even be aware of it if you got a loan. The appraiser would note it. We would do a determination to find out if you're in flood zone, but we have to do the determination even though we know it's highly unlikely, that virtually impossible to be in a flood zone, but we still have to do it per regulation. Again, people buying homes sometimes will make a decision on buying a home whether they're going to have to pay for flood insurance going forward. If they own the home free and clear, they don't have to buy it. If they're going to have a loan with a federally insured bank, they do. Same with commercial properties. So it's an interesting dynamic that we have to deal with all the time. Again, most people aren't even aware that we're doing it, especially if we don't send them a letter saying they need to have flood insurance.
Good evening. A couple of questions about the 1% chance. How is that determined? Is that through NOAA data, or you say it's a running 30-year average? Who's managing that data, and how is that calculated?
My understanding is that that is done by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, although I don't know exactly what their process is.
Second question then is within so many flood management issues, the 100-year and the 500-year event, and obviously the events in between the two majors, is that part of that 1% calculation, or is that a different set of calculations altogether?
A 100-year event is something that has a 1% chance of happening within any given year.
No, yes.
So it's that's sort of the common, almost slang way of describing it. Yeah, so a 1% chance event is a 100-year event. So in essence, the flood zone encompasses what would be 100-year events.
Okay. Yeah, that was just a terminology question. So, okay.
Yeah, but like with the recent floods in Germany, for instance, they're describing that as more of a 500-year event.
Yes, yes.
And so anything beyond the 100-year event is outside of the flood zone and not regulated by that.
Okay. Thank you.
Welcome.
Just a quick question. So we just approved this seawall on Croatia Way. And I actually was looking through the documents, and it looks like it's an A something, like A7 or A9. But that picture looked like that was probably Croatia Way. So
yes.
So is it reevaluated? Is that what you said?
It is reevaluated periodically. In essence, jurisdictions can choose to have these studies done, but that's cost prohibitive. So typically what everyone does is they wait for FEMA to get some grants together and do an area, which is why Puget Sound got done basically right up through all of Whidbey Island, and they stopped just south of us, which is unfortunate. Because they do take into account things like, the direction that the wind's coming from and what's actually happening there, and changes in the topography that may have happened since the last time they went around. And so what ends up happening when those map changes happen is that some properties will change their category, because just as a slightly more educated than casual observer, I would say, yes, that Croatian Way area sure looks like a VE zone to me.
Right.
But it is currently, I think it's AE9 is what it is there, which makes sense for a lot of it. But there's sort of that strip of houses right along Croatian Way, where it sure looks like we've got wind-driven waves happening there.
Right. Thank you.
And just a general note I thought I'd throw out there, in regards to how in Mount Vernon, for instance, the flood zones are a lot more subtle than they are in Anacortes. Our shoreline slopes up quickly enough that the flood zone is fairly short. So it's not like you end up with blocks of houses within the flood zone. You typically have individual properties that are, ringing the marine environment. And those are the ones, and they have the flood zone just simply on one portion of one property.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Are any global warming modeling taken into account when they do the revise to the flood zones?
My
Or
understanding
is that too controversial? I'm just curious.
I'll answer the question anyways, controversial or not. My understanding is that the answer is no, that the models are based on current existing conditions. Now, in essence, one of the hot buttons I have on my computer is to a site of, in essence, oceanographers and geographers and sea level scientists that look at possibilities of sea level rise. And over the next 70 years, it's guaranteed to rise at least a little bit. But then it gets down to the question as to whose model you look at as to how much it is. So there's like 100% probability of some rise. And then as you increase that parameter of how much rise you think it's going to be, the probabilities decrease of any given scenario. So in essence, they're looking at what the flood dangers are today rather than what the flood dangers might be in the future.
Anyone else have questions? Thank you. That was very informative.
Thank you, Rob. Madam Chair, I might
Welcome.
also mention, as Mr. Freisinger was explaining our firm maps, Skagit County and FEMA have been working on new firm maps, probably going on about 6 years, if not more. And so the ones that we're working off right now are 2003. We're hoping for some new maps, and those new maps, which I've had a look at, actually show some different designations for various shoreline areas around the island, such as out at Croatian Way. But those aren't adopted yet by FEMA for this area, nor are they adopted by Skagit County as yet. So we're still working off the old ones. So again, thank you, Rob. And Madam Chair, with that, I'd like to move on with a couple of things for you all on the floodplain management regulations. See if I can share a screen. So what we have is chapters 19.74, which is revised from the original frequently flooded areas, chapter AMC 1770-020, which was recently moved to, that language recently moved into chapter 1976-10 by the adoption of the Critical Areas Ordinance Monday night. So what we've done is worked with the Washington State Department of Ecology, floodplain, with the Flood Insurance Program Coordinator, David Radabaugh. So Mr. Radabaugh took our existing frequently flooded areas code, went through it, and made a bunch of comments on various things that were outdated and or inconsistent with the floodplain insurance program and or FEMA guidelines. And so what you have before you in your packet are a strike-through and underline version of the floodplain management code that includes Mr. Radabaw's comments, or excuse me, Mr. Radabaw's changes in strike-through and underline, although I need to figure out how to get that up. Matt, can you help me on this? It's not showing the strike-through and underline. Should be showing all that according to what it shows here. But it's not.
Click on the simple markup, drop-down menu. The arrow to your right, no, not show markup, right up above one. Up above one. All markups.
There we go. Thank you, Tess. So now we have all the changes that Mr. Radabaugh has asked for. Many of them are definitions. You'll see here we're talking about alteration of a water course. We're not going to see that in Anacortes. Then we're talking about rivers and streams, shallow flooding, area of shallow flooding. And so again, Mr. Radabaugh talked with us at length with Mr. Freisinger and myself about these changes, and that's what you see are his exact requirements for changes. Area of special flood hazard, and here's where you see the V, which is velocity, and those are the special flood hazard areas, for instance, the VE along Washington Park. Base flood elevation, the elevation which is the flood water as anticipated to rise during the base flood. Breakaway walls, mudslides. We get a bit of shoreline erosion. I'm not aware of any significant mudslides, a few small ones here and there. And that defines what that is. Flood elevation study and firm. Flood insurance rate map. Our floodplain, flood-prone areas, flood proofing, goes back through all that. And here we have the highest adjacent grade and historic structures sections. And again, these are all consistent with FEMA guidelines and NFIP. Mean sea level, and if I remember correctly, it's NAVD 29 on that. And so what you're looking at there is, as Mr. Freisinger showed you in that zone 8E, which typically around here is about a 9. And so with that NAVD 29, that's our base elevation in Anacortes, and you want to be 9 feet plus 1 foot of freeboard above that when you're building in an AE zone. And then in here we also now define new construction more clearly. Manufactured homes has been there. Substantial improvement, you can see that there's some changes here to be, again, consistent with FEMA guidelines and NFIP guidelines. And just tracking changes here is, of course, making sure that we're going to the right section because we're not using 1770 anymore, we're using the 1974. Administration. So a lot of the stuff that you see is also just tracking from one section to the next section. So interpretation of firm boundaries, you know, for the most part, as Mr. Freisinger mentioned, we use the online tools to determine specifically, and if you or anyone at home wants to check, you can actually get on the website that Mr. Freisinger showed, type in your address and determine what your flood elevation is for your particular address. Many of you won't have one because you're not in the flood zone, but if you're out in the skyline, you may very well have a flood designation. Here we talk about repairs, especially in national and historic places, maintaining the historic character of the structures. So that would apply to some of the some of the buildings along the shoreline, maybe the Glamis Channel where we have the historic canneries, things like that. Provisions of flood hazard reduction resulting from hydrodynamic and hydrostatic loads, including the effects of buoyancy, needed to be added for clarity. Subdivisions, other development. And here we talk about residential construction and what's required in specific zones. Example, AE, A1 through 30 zones or other A zones. And that's when you can actually determine the base flood elevation. And here it talks about elevated, must have the lowest floor, including basement, elevated 1 foot or more above the base flood elevation. And goes on to talk more about how that's determined. As Mr. Freisinger mentioned, when we do get a floodplain development permit application in, the first thing that's determined is what is that base flood elevation, and then what is the floor level going to be to achieve that 1 foot above the base flood elevation. And then we have also 2 foot there in unnumbered zones. Then we talk about the garage and other areas. In a garage, for instance, you want automatic entry and exit of floodwaters, and in many cases what that means is you have a garage overhead door and then a man door in the back, and the water just flows right through. Yes, it leaves silt on your garage floor. If any of you have ever been anywhere near one of the river floods, I have. They're kind of interesting. This section deals with non-residential construction, so, commercial construction again. And again, in those undesignated areas, 2 feet, designated areas 1 foot above the base flood elevation. And then there's the coastal high hazard areas for V1 through 30, and or the VE zones. So we have a very, very few VE zones. But it also gives you all the requirements in here for that, especially the construction requirements. Commercial buildings, dry flood proofed 1 foot more or more above the base flood level for a structure, water type with walls. So I know I'm briefly just going through this. We're going to have more opportunities to talk about this in the future. Here we're talking about appurtenant structures, detached garages, small storage structures, things like that. Anchored to prevent flotation, collapse, lateral movement. Those are all required by the building code anyway. But we would want to make sure that that's listed on their permit drawings. This is the coastal high hazard area section that I was mentioning, and it goes through with some new designations, or rather some new requirements to coincide with FEMA guidelines. And then we'd just a little cleanup action on the end. So I heard a couple of comments and questions about sea level rise. And I think Mr. Freisinger mentioned storm surge and wind-driven waves. So the firm maps with their designations, and especially the VE, address the wind-driven waves and storm surges. What, as Rob mentioned, this does not address is sea level rise. So in working with Mr. Adebaugh, I took the opportunity to ask him what his thoughts were on that. And he, as did Mr. Freisinger, said that, there's a lot of data out there, and the question is if you're going to do that, well, what data do you actually use? Mr. Adebaugh has mentioned that a few jurisdictions have just said, okay, well, we're going to address global warming and sea level rise by adding an extra foot of freeboard. So instead of 1 foot above the base flood elevation for your lowest floor, you would be 2 feet. And so that's something that the commissioners could think about you wanted to do a little research on that on your own, that's up to you. But, you know, from a staff perspective, we would like you to think about that so that when we move forward to the city council with your recommendation, then we have detailed out, okay, yes, we've considered sea level rise, and here's what we recommend. And if the commissioners would like staff to bring back some information on that, we could certainly take a look at that. Any thoughts?
I would be more than interested in doing some research on this. What sourcing documents would you suggest that we would use to justify, you know, the fact that there is that one, you know, the level of rise due to global warming? I mean, what are you using as your sourcing data?
Thank you, Mr. Kraft. So there's a lot of information out there. What we could do is work with one of our consultants, geoengineers, Jay Gordon. He's done some work on this for us through the critical areas ordinance. So I'll pull out the pages where he talks about sea level rise and bring those to our next meeting.
I'm also interested in this topic as well. I am aware that King County Critical Area Ordinance, as well as their environmental staff, has done some of this work already, and you may want to contact the King County Planning Department and their environmental team. They're quite strong, and they've taken this and added the new component to it that their own capital improvement programs within these areas now must reflect these new standards. And it's whether it's a salmon run or a culvert or a seawall, they've done a tremendous amount of work, and they have a book. I think it's just simply called the Green Book, making it simple. But anyway, I may be able to give you a contact if you don't already have one. But anyway, thank you for suggesting this.
So, and in my conversation with Mr. Radabaugh, I think he mentioned King County and that they had actually added an extra 1 foot and or some language that sea level rise shall be considered through all floodplain permits. So I'll put some information together and bring that back. To clarify when I say bring it back, so we have scheduled a public hearing for the 25th of August. Tonight is just a public meeting, and so no action will be taken tonight. If there's anybody from the public who wants to speak, they're certainly free to come in and speak or speak on the Zoom call. We have various things coming in on the 11th, and then on the 25th we'll open up the public hearing and then continue as we need to get to a point where we have a recommendation for City Council as a legislative procedure. Any other?
Can I ask one more question? I was going to ask our resident insurance expert down the, I mean, what kind of impact would adding 1 foot to this have on residents that would be impacted by this? I mean, obviously they would probably be in a flood zone now, right?
Yeah, you'd still have to buy insurance.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any thought, though, if we're going to raise that, any thought about raising the height limitation by a foot? I know a lot of people plan their roof line to our current. Would it be fair to think, have us think about raising the height limit by a foot, by that same foot?
A great question, Mr. Dreschke. So you're right. If we were to say you need an additional 1 foot freeboard, that's going to raise the building of the height by a foot, and it could complicate their maximum height of 35 foot in most zones. But we've not considered any trade-off there of allowing up to 36 feet, say, if they add that additional height. But maybe that's something that we need to consider as a recommendation to City Council as we move forward.
Sounds good to me. I'd be curious to see if there's other jurisdictions, coastal jurisdictions, maybe similar. It doesn't have to be Washington, but that have done something similar, and maybe the pros and cons, like kind of that analysis of like we did this and then we had to, that would be useful, because it's hard to think like those kinds of unintended consequences, what would those be?
Sure. And I can work with our consultant geoengineers. We can put some graphs together that show various coastal cities. For instance, Seaside, Oregon, what are they doing? And maybe we've got some good ideas from there. We could definitely do that.
Just a technical, I've got a few typos in this report. Who do I talk to about that, or does it matter? Is somebody else going to go through them?
That's a great question, Ms. Martin. Yeah, if you've identified some typos, please feel free to email me and let me know what those are, or just mark them up and give me a copy. And I'll be glad to work on those.
Okay.
And if anybody else has anything like that, just email me, drop them off. I'll be glad to take care of it.
Thanks.
Any other comments? Do we have any more business to discuss, Mr. Messner?
I think that's an end to our evening, Madam Chair. Thank you.
And, meeting adjourned?
Thank you. And it's nice to see everybody here tonight.